So I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I especially want to thank Ryan and Rachel Ruse, the owners, proprietors of this wonderful little establishment, for their continued willingness to host these kinds of events. I think they're terrific for the Mormon Studies community, for downtown Provo. I want to thank Russell for making his flight today as well. Just by the skin of his teeth he got here, so we're happy to have him. And we're just here. This is going to be, I think those of you who attend these events regularly are more accustomed to seeing kind of a panel discussion. We're going to go a little different angle this time. Russell's just going to give us a quick, I don't want to say lecture. He's going to talk about kind of the inspiration for writing the book, some of the background, and then to the extent that there's a discussion, it's not a panel discussion, but really an audience discussion. So we're gonna kind of extend that part. Hopefully Russell will just give us 15 or 20 minutes on the kind of background, and then we can go as long as we want with the Q&A. Don't hesitate to ask about anything, obviously, and then we also have some refreshments in the back for afterward. So without any further ado, do you want me to give you any more formal introduction than just Russell Stevenson is the author of this? He also wrote another book, which is a biography of Elijah Abel. Man, most of us know as Elijah Abel. It's spelled on the cover, and it's spelled in historical documents, Abels. Mm-hmm. Is it pronounced? Do we know if it was pronounced historically Abels, or if it was just spelled Abels?
I mean, you can find a spelling for literally. Yeah. I mean, all of the variants, right? The most common ones were Abels, like that was number one.
A-B-L-E-S.
A-B-L-E-S, and then A-B-L-E is a strong contender for second, so you can make it.
How do you usually pronounce it?
I end up pronouncing it Abels, just because that's how it appeared most often in the documents, and in most of the early documents as well.
So any questions you have about Elijah, his history, about the book? I will say up front, just by way of introduction of the book itself, that I think it's significant that Russell's research here is helping us. I think the book is unique in two ways. In one, it's helping us move the conversation about the history of race in Mormonism in the LDS Church beyond just the question of either specific groups in the American context. I think in particular, in the past, when we talk about Mormons of black African descent, the focus tends to be either on African American Mormons or on kind of specific regions in Africa, like the role that African congregations played in putting pressure on the church to reconsider the priesthood and temple ban. On the one hand, and what I think is so great about this book is that it's really, in some ways you can think about it as a history of not just blacks and Mormonism, but an examination of how black history and Mormon history are related to each other. So it really broadens the argument both thematically and geographically. I think it's very helpful. And then there are also just a ton of great documents in the book. So the first half of the book is kind of a narrative history, standard history. The second half is essentially collections of relevant historical documents, and so you can kind of get right to the primary sources on a lot of this stuff. So very, very useful material here. Now I'll actually turn the time over to Russell and have a seat.
Thank you. So good to be here. As he said, it has been something of an adventure, making it from A to B. Anyone who's flown in or into or out of O'Hare Airport, you have some sense of the kind of frenzy that tends to dominate that airport. Yet I waltzed in and out. It was easier than Salt Lake City, so it was truly an O'Hare miracle this time. So a little bit about this book, about where it came from.
Russell, real quick.
Yes.
I think it's going to be better visually if
I'm
scoot over to the other side of the chair. I kind of framed you centrally
That's
there.
Fine. So. All right. So a little bit about where this book came from, right? What inspired me to write it, because this is hands down, I would say it's in the top 3 as far as controversial topics in Latter-day Saint history. Right up there with polygamy, perhaps the translation of the Book of Mormon. But this is the kind of thing that gets people's emotions going. This is the kind of thing that leads to faith crises. I have more than one friend who has, in fact, either left the church or or had serious qualms about continuing to affiliate with the church due to the kinds of issues that this history brings up. So when you start talking about this, it's important that we all recognize that we're not just dealing with some kind of stale history, right? It's not just another story. You can't tell this in the same kind of way that maybe you may be able to tell the story of the settlement of some colony in Utah. This is the kind of story with social, cultural, and political implications. So we're dealing with heavy things, and in some ways that's what inspired me to write. I think of a quote by G.K. Chesterton where he said, "I like getting into hot water; it keeps me clean." So I sometimes am attracted to controversy, if only because the sheer implications of it requires that we up our game. It requires that we have a good, solid conversation about the documents, where the documents lead us, and what does the evidence mean. But what's my background? I firmly believe that whenever we read a book, we have a right to know something about the vessel, something about the messenger. Because whenever we come to a conversation, we come to it with a certain set of life experiences. And like it or not, those life experiences inform the kinds of questions that we ask. They inform the way we frame the conversation and the direction that we're taking the conversation. So I obviously am not black. So what business do I have telling the story of black people? I grew up in western Wyoming, right? Rural town. A grand total of 2,000 people in my hometown. We were technically considered to be a frontier county as late as 2010. No stoplights. The high school had a grand total of about 800 people, and that covers an area of about 40 miles. So we're talking rural America, the kind of place where the pharmacist knows your name, they know what ails you, and you call them in the middle of the night, and they go downtown and fix something up for you. It's very tight-knit, right? It's very close. And I think we had one African-American student in the whole high school, right? And of course, everyone loved him because he was the token black, as is often the case in heavily white communities. So what business do I have, right? My grandfather, he was a police officer for the LAPD in the 1960s, in the years leading up to the Watts riots. And we have this fabulous picture that was used for a police department periodical where he's coming home and all of his white children are running out from their suburban-esque home and they're jumping up and down. And it looks like a microcosm of what we often imagine 1950s television to be. Very Leave It to Beaver-esque. All the children were proud of their police officer father. They would shine his police badge, and they all talked about how great it was to have a father who was such a pillar of the community. And yet, in this idyllic, setting, right? In this idyllic situation, we all knew something that was that plagued my grandfather. Right? He was seen as a pillar of the community, and yet we all knew that he struggled with race. An example from my own experiences with him. We have big Stevenson family reunions, and these reunions are the kinds of things. It's the stuff of lore, right? We have a Stevenson family song. We have a cheer. Stevensons would start their own country if they had the opportunity, to be quite honest. But one day we began talking about Granddad's participation in the police force and some of how his negative experiences with the black population informed his views on race. And one of my uncles, who is well connected to the church hierarchy, in fact, he is closely related to a relatively famous general authority, he said, "You know what? Whatever else we want to say about my father-in-law's views on race, we know one thing, and that is, it is indefensible." And yet we saw him as this great patriarch. Right? We saw him as this tremendous human being who produced this wonderful family, all active in Mormonism, all faithful to the tradition of our fathers and our grandfathers, etc., so on and so forth. So how do you reconcile these things? How can a man that we see as being so good at the same time be so wrong about something so gravely important? This is a question that haunted the Stevenson family for years and years, and this is something that we all had to come to grips with to some degree. And later in life, my grandfather was traveling to Missouri with a couple of his sons, and one of them said, "Dad, would you ever want your children or your grandchildren to adopt your views on African Americans?" And his answer surprised me. He said, "No." So he too recognized it as his Achilles heel. My effort to come to grips with that legacy ultimately led me to write the story of Elijah Abels, because that compelled me, and it compelled my family, to be quite honest, to revisit how we had talked about race. Because Elijah Abels, as his story goes, his existence requires that we question everything we thought we knew about how we typically tell the race story in Mormonism. 9 times out of 10, the story goes something like this, and this is the story that Bruce McConkie used in his 1979 edition of Mormon Doctrine. To everything there is a season. Every race has a time in which you receive all the blessings of the gospel, the priesthood, etc., etc. And there was a time for white people, and now there's a time for black people, just as there was a time for the Jews. There was a time for the Gentiles. But the sheer existence of Elijah Abels, who can be documented as a priesthood holder as early as 1836, there's no debate about that. This isn't something that we speculate. This isn't something we're reading between the lines. We have the Smoking Gun document. There really isn't any serious question to be asked about this. So how then do we continue to tell that narrative about the time for the whites and the time for the blacks? So as I wrote that book and I began to question how we had talked about race, how my grandfather had talked about race, I began to say, well, what else is there? What other assumptions have we not questioned in our community? How have we bounded the kinds of stories that we tell about black people in the Mormon community? And I found that this didn't just exist within the conservative circles of my family, and they were conservative. My father campaigned for Barry Goldwater. It also existed within what we would call progressive Mormons and liberal Mormons as well. Oftentimes, the focus has been on the African American civil rights experience, and rightly so. That is an important story, and one that I spend a whole chapter discussing in my book. But the story of the Nigerian Latter-day Saints it's been dominated by people like E. Dale LeBaron. He did that tremendous oral history project with BYU, and you have a large body of interviews that he conducted with African Latter-day Saints. And that story is often used to uphold this, this old school McConkie narrative, of a time for the whites. And obviously now we have a pair of people who have been cultivated in the eyes of the Lord, and now they're ripe for conversion. So I saw these different stereotypes that different communities within the Latter-day Saint faith had held up, and I said we need to stop. We need to stop seeing these as, one, factionalized narratives, and two, as ideologically motivated narratives. We need to use them. We need to create a space in which the black voice can speak for itself to the degree that we are capable of creating those sorts of conditions, and to the degree that I, as a relatively privileged white American, am able to create those conditions. So what is the ultimate purpose of my book? It's to force us to revisit what we thought we knew about blacks and Mormonism, whatever perspective we may have coming into our relationship with the church, whether we consider ourselves progressive Latter-day Saints, whether we consider ourselves conservative Latter-day Saints, whether we consider ourselves mainstream Latter-day Saints who don't really have some sort of ideological persuasion. And that's what, especially the documents are meant to do. Because sometimes people are rightly or wrongly skeptical of us historians, right? They think that we're filtering it and that we're biased and that we're trying to cover things up. And I mean, obviously, we all have our sets of assumptions and our biases. But call me old school. I would like to think that we can maybe step outside of those, maybe an inch or two, step beyond the darkness of our own assumptions into a greater measure of light. And I hope that my book facilitates that in some small way, and we'll see if that's successful.
Thanks, Russell.
Any questions, please? Snyder Marks complaints, yes.
Could you show us the family cheer?
Well, I'm happy to recite a verse of it for you. It sounds like it was from the old school, it's sung to a drinking song, I might add. An old Irish tune. And it goes something like this, be an example of all that is good, control your thoughts and tongue as you should, think with your heads, and love with your hearts, serve with your hands, to do your part.
Sounds like an old Mormon hymn. Praise to the man, a drinking song.
Yeah, Scotland Brave. Yeah. Scotland Brave, it's true. So yeah, it's one of those things where we all sing it entirely sober, and we sing it unironically, I might add.
The serious question, though, was what was your biggest takeaway doing this research? What do you find yourself repeating over and over again whenever people are asking you about what you've done?
As I think about the story of blacks and Mormonism, I think about the kinds of struggles that, in fact, the white community has had to go through to purge their racist ghosts. I see the relationship between blacks and Mormonism as a story of an unfinished redemption of the Mormon community. As the Mormon community's efforts to shake off the baggage that they picked up from their 19th century forebears. And time and time again, I see how deeply this racism had seeped into the Mormon community. It was manifested in popular culture. It was manifested in teachings. It was manifested in offhand remarks. It was manifested in personal letters. This wasn't something that just existed in comments made by David O. McKay to Huey Brown in some meeting house. It was something that had become, and I emphasize that, become a part of the Mormon identity for a rather long time. And the Mormon community has had to pay an immense price for that. And it's not been easy to shake that off, and to some degree we're still shaking that off.
So I have a follow-up question to that then. We've been looking a lot at increased kinds of transparency. Mm-hmm. Just a little over a year ago, we saw the release of the LDS.org essay on our racial history, and particularly on the priesthood and temple ban. And as conversations continue to occur, and as 1978 continues to be invoked by in particular by intellectual Mormons who are trying to think about the question of a church that's run by both revelation and fallible leaders, and what's shifting, and what does the future look like, and what's being contested. 78 factors really heavily into these narratives, and so we often find ourselves having arguments about 78, and having arguments about what it means, having arguments about our racial history. And frankly, mostly white people having arguments with other white people about it. My question, though, is there a deficiency in the way that we're having this argument? And in particular, I'm wondering about how we actually use not just the word race, but racism in this argument, in these conversations. Because very often we'll see ourselves saying, right, you'll see the allegation made that racism is the explanation for the ban. And then you'll see the counter-argument made that we don't know the origins of the ban, so we don't know if it was racism that caused the ban, right? And I think that presupposes a definition of racism that is mental, that is equal to racial prejudice, which I think disguises from us the real problem and prevents us from maybe moving forward as a people, which is that the motivation for the ban is, or where it comes from, those are interesting questions, but that's not the only place where the question of racism is relevant. The ban, it's like asking, was Jim Crow motivated by racism? Jim Crow was racism. The ban was racist. It was racism. It was the withholding of blessings, privileges, access participation on the basis of race. So it doesn't matter what motivated it. Mm-hmm. The racism of the ban has nothing to do with the mental state. I mean, it may be reinforced, it may have originated, it's connected to the mental states of the people that are involved, but ultimately, it is racism. And so how can we move past, can we repudiate racism without fully repudiating the ban and not just the explanations or the folklore or the false theology or whatever? Can we afford as a community not to repudiate the ban itself?
That's really the $1 million question. And a few thoughts on that. So it's always interesting to me to hear white Latter-day Saints say, especially, it wasn't racism, right? Because that is a great example of white privilege at work, right? Because we white people, we feel like we will define what is and is not racism, right? That's our privilege. Yeah. And if you want to say it's racism, well, we have the power to say that it's not. So to your, more directly to your question, can we repudiate racism without repudiating the ban? I think if we want to look at the foundational tenet of Mormonism when it comes to race, you have to look at the Book of Mormon, right? Whether you accept the Book of Mormon to be a historically accurate document or not, did Nephi exist?
It's a very related question, no question.
It is related, yeah. But you could, let's just say it came from the mind of Joseph Smith for the sake of this conversation, right? You could accept that and still say that the foundational tenet of race is that all are alike unto God, both black and white, bond and free, male and female, right? That is the foundational tenet of what race should be.
And yet in that scripture, it's right alongside vivid examples of white supremacy.
Right, cursings, right? And that's one of the tremendous contradictions of the experience of the Book of Mormon, yeah. Right? Because in the same breath, you see these transcendent doctrines of equality and in universalism. Well, they're talking about people being filthy and loathsome because of their dark skin. As to whether we can repudiate the ban without repudiate racism without repudiating the ban, I think that's very hard to do, right? You look at what the statement that the church released in 2013 said about this. They said we condemn racism past and present.
In all its forms.
In all of its forms, mm-hmm. Right? And if racism means that you draw distinctions based on the color of the skin, on ethnicity, on national origin, well, that's what the priesthood restriction did. And no church leader would have said otherwise. Brigham Young drew distinctions based on race, and he would have said so himself.
Yeah.
So, I personally have a hard time seeing how anyone can make a compelling case that we can allow the doctrinal basis for the priesthood ban to exist, while at the same time saying, I don't believe in racism, I reject racism.
Can we take that step of saying, I think conversations about whether there should be an apology or whatever kind of sidestep the main question, which is, can we admit that it was wrong?
That the ban was wrong. I think for those who are interested in doing so, I think there's space for that. It would be an emotionally and theologically hard thing to do in the sense that it would require that we start asking hard questions about what prophetic infallibility is. It would also require that we start asking hard questions about the relationship between the Mormon community and its prophets, right?
Right.
Because, you look at the origins of the ban, and in my book I do actually try to take a step towards saying, well, we may not know the day that the ban came into existence, but we do certainly know like the basic time frame, between March of 1847 and February of 1849. In that particular time frame, you start to see that, well, it was actually the Mormon lay members who were taking the lead in pushing for this ban. And that raises some questions, right? To what degree does the Mormon community have agency in establishing the trajectory and the doctrines of the church, right? And that's one of those things that forces us to point the finger at ourselves, and we don't like doing that.
So is that part of your answer then, that if, as we as a community come to the conclusion and are willing to accept the fact that it was wrong, that eventually we can that change can be reflected at an institutional or at a top leadership level?
I think that's a possibility. You look at what John Sorensen said in 1960, specifically in reference to the priesthood ban. John Sorensen, he was the famous Mormon anthropologist of Mesoamerica, and he said on more than one occasion, the Mormon community has in fact led out in establishing Mormon practice on various issues. He pointed to prohibition, he pointed to relationship with native tribes, and he said, in some ways, the church leaders are actually afraid of being progressive because they feel that they would lose church members. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I think that you can easily make the argument that that has been a legitimate feeling on the parts of church leaders. It certainly was the case in 1847, when you have a mob of Latter-day Saints that chased a black man out of winter quarters, prompting Orson Hyde and probably Hugh Pratt to give voice to the very first articulation of the priesthood ban.
So you see, you look closely at this history, and is it fair to say that you see leaders more reflecting where the community at large is than driving it?
In the earliest stages, I do see that.
Do you see that in the 60s and 70s too, or do you see more or I guess at various other stages too? When it comes to the questions of do we send missionaries into Africa? I mean, there are going to be other key points in our history thinking about how do we parse who counts as black and who doesn't in different parts of the world. I mean,
right.
Where do you see the people and the prophets?
Right. That's a great question. By the late 1870s, early 1880s, the practice had become so entrenched in the Mormon community that it ends up being, I don't even know if you can draw a distinction. Right? They played off of each other time and time again. They reinforced each other, right?
Closed circuit kind of thing.
Right, but the fact that in March of 1847, Brigham Young was very supportive of blacks holding the priesthood, even to the point of talking back to the saints, saying, "Listen, you need to allow blacks to hold the priesthood." The fact that he was willing to say that tells you that there was a real divide, at least in the earliest stages, but over the course of the next few years, any commitment that he once had towards that, it had dissolved in the face of other forces.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Since we're going conversational on this, in the Gospel of Sociology, we talk about that man affects society as society is affecting the individual. Mm-hmm. Right? So it is a push me, pull me type response that it seems like you're talking about here. Right? Individuals and or your group are both kind of dialectically working together.
Yes, I think that's...
Now, how is, getting back to your book, because that's what we're here for tonight, how much white guilt am I going to get from reading your book?
When it comes to white guilt, I think of Tim Wise. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Tim Wise does not believe in white guilt. He says, we deal with race not because we are guilty, but because we are here. Because we are beneficiaries of a society that, that has valued whiteness. So, at no point does Tim Wise or even I would say most radical academics say that you, Brian, are guilty for the sins of slavery. Right? That's a straw man argument. But as you read this book, or as anybody reads this book, I hope the question comes up, to what degree have I, as a white member of the church, been able to get away with not asking hard questions? That's a form of white privilege.
Yeah.
Right? Being able to, be a mainstream member of the church, I'm just going to church, this is great, this is fine, I love going to the temple. And yeah, racism is bad, but
whatever, it's something.
that was unfortunate, wish we didn't have to deal with that, but oh well, that's life. And whenever someone tells me that, I say, well, the reason you can say that is because you're white, right? Because you've never had someone tell you to your face, you can't go into that building and enjoy the same blessings as your white brothers and sisters.
Or you shouldn't marry this guy because you're of a different race or something like that. I mean, that's probably more likely to...
Yes. Yeah, that's certainly the more recent example. Yes.
I'm curious to hear your opinion on the narrative that the speaking outside of the church and talking about the lifting of the priesthood ban. Right. The narrative I hear a lot, and I'm sure you've all heard, is that this was some sort of cynical political ploy by the brethren. They finally caved into the civil rights movement and such, where there was people allege that there was political strongman from Washington and all sorts of stuff. So I'm curious, your thoughts on that narrative. If the book goes into that at all. And
it does. Yeah. It does. I spent a whole chapter. The name of the chapter is called "The World Is Ready," and that's a quote from Spencer W. Kimball in addressing the official Declaration Number 2. And I use that phrase because if we try to make the origins of official Declaration Number 2 overly monocausal, then we are going to go astray, right? If you want to talk about the IRS, right? That's something that people bring up a lot. The IRS was threatening to take away the church's tax-exempt status. If that's all you talk about, you're being myopic, right? Because there were a lot of things happening, not just in the Mormon community in Utah, but in the Mormon community globally, that were forcing church leaders to reevaluate their assumptions about the viability of the priesthood ban. In fact, as early as as 1962 or 1961, actually, you have Mormon missionaries who are doing exploratory missions to Nigeria who said the priesthood ban is no longer viable. We can't do this. Not if we're going to be a global faith community. So, really, when I talk about official Declaration Number 2, I talk about it coming from a constellation of forces, right? I mean, you've got forces in Nigeria, you've got forces in Brazil, the building of the São Paulo Brazil temple. You obviously have the civil rights movement, which forced church members to start thinking about their relationship with the black community.
In the building of the DC temple too, in a pretty overwhelmingly black demographic area.
Yes, exactly. Of course, you have comments by Ezra Taft Benson, where he basically said the civil rights movement was a product of a global communist conspiracy, and that caused certain Latter-day Saints to be a little bit allergic to the civil rights movement. But for Ezra Taft Benson, you also have James E. Faust, where he was hands down one of the most articulate and committed civil rights proponents in the state of Utah.
Didn't he do a mission in Brazil?
He did do a mission in Brazil, and I'm convinced that mission experience influenced how he saw the black question. There was a man by the name of John W. Fitzgerald. He was an EDD from Columbia and a committed supporter of the civil rights movement and opponent of the priesthood ban. Very principled man, also a very troubled man. And in 1972, he had become so committed to this and so public about it that it was going to cost him his membership in the church, and it did, ultimately. The First Presidency sent James E. Faust to go to try and reclaim John W. Fitzgerald. And Faust made a very interesting comment. He said, listen, John, you're not attending church. You're not paying a tithe. You're not doing your home teaching. Do these things, and they'll listen. He didn't say do these things and stop worrying about it. He said do these things, and you'll be in a place to effect change within the Mormon community. Now, you can argue that is ill-advised. You can argue that isn't really true to form or true to experience. In fact, that's exactly what John W. Fitzgerald says. Listen, I've tried all these things, and it's not working. But the fact of the matter is that you do have kind of a swelling movement within the church, even in terms of civil rights, that led church leaders to start saying, this restriction, maybe it's not the same thing that we once thought it was. Brigham Young, he tied it part and parcel with supporting slavery. Right? At least by the 1960s and 1970s, you have church leaders saying, okay, well, we believe in civil rights, but we're going to continue to uphold this theological practice.
What, just as a follow-up to that, and I hope I'm not taking it, if there's a hand up behind me or anything.
I got it.
Okay, you go after. Do you have some sense when you're talking about these individuals who are sort of working behind the scenes, trying to wield influence in the decade or so leading up to the lifting of the restriction? Do you have some sense of the role that Lowell Bennion played?
Yes, Lowell Bennion does play an interesting role. So I just mentioned the case of John W. Fitzgerald.
Mm-hmm.
Lowell Bennion actually testified at his excommunication hearing. And,
That's interesting.
Yes. And Fitzgerald was deeply frustrated with Bennion's efforts because he said, listen, Bennion wasn't nearly as articulate as I wanted him to be. He wasn't nearly as committed to the cause as I wanted him to be.
Bennion did not want to lose his leadership over it.
No, he
his
did not.
membership over it.
Yeah, you see, Bennion valued his insider status. And by this point, Fitzgerald had become somewhat radioactive. So Bennion, he was willing to testify on Fitzgerald's behalf, but he wasn't willing to invest too much. But at the same time, you also have Bennion making, holding debates at BYU with people like Chauncey Riddle, in which Bennion would say things like, listen, the reason the priesthood ban continues to exist is because we as a Mormon community are not willing to see it in any other way. And this is a surprisingly common theme amongst self-styled Mormon progressives and even some conservatives, John Sorensen included. You have Lowell Bennion saying this. It's because we as a community are not willing to countenance it. You have Sterling and McMurrin saying this. You have Lowell Bennion saying it. You have Lowell Bennion saying it as well. So that is a pretty common theme that amongst Bennion and others, that the Mormon community was not willing to go there just yet. And Eugene England said it as well, that it had less to do with the leaders and more with the state of Mormons in Utah.
All right. Michael Homer published a book recently on the Temple Endowments for Signature Books.
Yes.
He has a section that I thought was really interesting about operative masonry and speculative masonry and the idea about the descendants of Ham having an illegitimate priesthood. When I was looking in your index, I may have overlooked it. I didn't notice any mention of Freemasonry or Michael Homer's book, but I'm thinking maybe it's because it was just recently published and maybe you didn't get a chance to.
Yeah, that certainly played a role in the timeline. That being said, I have read the relevant sections on race in Michael Homer's book, and it's a great book. Okay, let me just throw that out there. He does make a claim that I find interesting, and I've looked into it and I question it. He says that in the edition of the Pearl of Great Price that was canonized in the late 1870s that there was a passage that was added in talking about the descendants of Cain being cursed with blackness, and he says that it was added in, and if you go and look at the original edition of the book of the Book of Moses translation, those words are in there. So I'm not sure where.
Did you engage his book at all?
I did not engage the book. Yeah, because again, the timeline just didn't allow it. But someone did point out that book to me, and I looked at it, and if I had access to it, I certainly would have.
Okay.
What about just the practice? I mean, if we don't want to focus specifically on like the stories or the sort of ideological contribution that it makes that Freemasonry may have made to Mormon racism, what about just this basic fact that in Nauvoo that the introduction of the endowment and which coincided closely with the initiation of elite Mormons into Freemasonry, that involve, on the one hand, that involves a kind of transformation of how priesthood is understood.
Right.
And the priesthood is understood at that point, that the endowment is understood as a kind of fullest expression of priesthood, right? And therefore, but at the same time that what it's reflecting culturally and what it's sort of drawing on culturally is, and even theologically, in the sense that I also think that a number of early endowed Mormons believe that the endowment was, as on the one hand, the fullest expression of priesthood, on the other hand, the fullest expression of Masonry.
Right.
And that Masonry was the Freemasonry in general was a highly, highly segregated institution. And so does the, again, there's no evidence that the band is explicitly articulated in Nauvoo, possibly just for lack of there being a reason to articulate it, of potential black candidates to take to the temple. But does the timeline that you're talking about in Utah, I'm wondering, does it happen to coincide with significant developments in terms of starting to do endowments, starting to standardize endowment ceremonies? You know, is it possible that logic is still having an influence?
Chronologically, it makes sense. So, Homer's argument, even though it was based on documentation that I don't fully see how he drew that from the documentation, but chronologically, it's one of those things that's believable, because in 1879, Elijah approaches the first presidency and says, "Listen, I would like to receive my endowment. My wife has just died. It's time." And, he had applied for it earlier, and Brigham Young had denied him. And seeing the conversation between him and church leaders is pretty revealing as far as I'm concerned, because they refer to him as a man named Abel in the minutes. And given his prominence in the Mormon community, that shows a pretty stark contrast from being this beloved of Joseph Smith, a very close friend, you might even say some kind of confidant, to suddenly just becoming a man named Abel. Mm-hmm. There you do see some kind of connection between the standardization of the endowment and the systematization of the denial of black people from full priesthood blessings.
In other words, because all priesthood is subsumed under sort of the progressive logic leading to the temple and the temple itself, then the full articulation of the priesthood ban, sort of implementation of the priesthood ban, really is in fact a temple ban.
Yes. That was the first. The first articulation of the priesthood restriction was in April of 1847. Mm-hmm. That's with Parley P. Pratt. But that you don't really see it systematized throughout the Mormon community for another generation, because obviously Elijah was allowed to hold on to his priesthood.
When is the endowment house completed?
The endowment house is completed in the mid 1850s. I think 1855. And, Elijah, he had requested, I think, in the early 1850s. So, you do see some correlation there. But, again, by the late 1870s, that's when you see that no longer was Brigham Young was it just like one or two speeches given by Brigham Young, where he says, I don't think, black people were worthy to hold the priesthood. This is when it becomes a rule.
Yeah.
In fact, in 1861, you see an interesting letter by a man named N.B. Johnson, where he says, "I have black ancestry. Am I eligible to hold the priesthood?" So there's still some ambiguity there.
There's not the one drop.
The one drop rule isn't being applied. So there was still this sense that, okay, well, if I have black ancestry, I might still be eligible for to hold the priesthood. It hadn't been reified yet. Mm-hmm. So yes, in regards to the endowment Freemasonry, I think you can absolutely draw a connection there. Yes.
What are some of the sources that you have in the book that maybe you're most excited about that haven't been used before in research?
One source was actually an oral history on an interview I conducted with Kathy Stokes. And, obviously she's a significant Black Latter-day Saint for a number of reasons, but one reason that has not been fully appreciated is her work as a high-level diplomat on behalf of the church in Ghana. In 1989, 1990, the church was expelled from Ghana for a variety of reasons. The God makers had been released, in the Ghanaian community, and that freaked Ghanaians out. They felt we were some kind of anti-Christian cult. But making matters worse, Mormons were known for driving cars, and it's in Nigeria and Ghana, driving a car is the symbol of economic colonialism.
Yeah.
Right? That's a great way to convince people that you're there to take over the country. So the Mormons are kicked out, and Neil A. Maxwell calls up Kathy Stokes and says, we need a powerful, articulate African-American woman to go and speak on our behalf. Would you please do that?
And is she successful?
She was successful.
Wow.
And I have a good solid hour of interview that I conducted with her. I tell her story in detail, her interactions with the press, and her ability to convince these rather hardened Ghanaian leaders to look at the Mormons with a fresh eye.
Because I can imagine that you look at the work that, for example, President Benson did back when he was an apostle and sort of helping to save the church in certain parts of Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine that if an apostle had been responsible for that repair, it'd be a part of what we talk about. There would already be books written about it and stuff. But that's a really amazing story.
It's very moving, and she worked closely with various general authorities on this. I mean, she met one when she flew to Great Britain and met a general authority there, and they talked about the strategy. But most of her work was on her own. Yes.
So I do have another question about your book. Before I ask that, though, I wanted to just comment back on the Masonry conversation, because I don't think any Mormon conversation should be depleted of this Masonry central focus.
Right. It's impossible to do. So
it's virtually impossible to do. No, and mostly it's just because I think that we oftentimes are looking for causality.
Yeah.
And straining for causality sometimes, when to me it's almost like saying that the increase of ice cream sales means that we're going to have more drowned children.
Right.
When there's this third party thing that's going on called summertime. Right. There's more kids swimming and buying ice cream. Right. So sometimes I think that Masonry and Mormonism are following a very similar trajectory, overlapping, following a similar trajectory with larger social currents. Right.
But we're talking about Brigham Young.
Sure, absolutely.
But, almost in some ways more Mason than he was Mormon. So.
Could be. Anyway, that's my comment on that, and that could be. Hopefully, we'll get more books published on that, where they diverge and where they correspond.
Right.
My question on your book is, so I think that it's safe to say that our biggest treatments that we've had on the race question in the past is Lester Bush's dialogue article, and perhaps Armin Moss's All Abraham's Children.
And Bill Brighurst's book as well. Let me throw that one out there.
Recent BYU Studies piece on 78 was, I think,
right by Ed Kimball. That's
pretty seminal. Yeah.
Situate your book in with the larger works that have been out there. How does it complement? How does it diverge? How does it challenge?
Right. So those works obviously provide the foundation for any conversation about race in Mormon history. But I had Lester Bush actually review my book, and he said that at first he said, "Well, I want you to talk more about the priesthood ban. Why don't you talk more about the priesthood ban?" And I responded, and I said, "Well, my book isn't. It's not called A Global History of Mormonism and the Priesthood Ban, right? It's a global history of blacks and Mormonism." So what I was seeking to do is say, one, there is more to the Mormon-black relationship than just the priesthood ban, right? One really invigorating and exciting story I tell is the story of John M. Goddard, who was a famous Mormon explorer of Africa, nationally renowned, right? He produced several documentaries about two documentaries about his experience in Africa. He rode down the Nile on a kayak.
What years are you talking about?
This is riding down the Nile. That was in the that was in the early 1950s, and then a few years later, he spent some time in the Congo, and using him as a lens, you learn a lot about what the popular Mormon perspective on Africa was, because he was well liked in the Mormon community. He did fundraisers for the missionary fund, and he helped to donate money to the church building fund. He helped to buy an organ in a church in Panguitch. So as far as how I would, how that story highlights the relationship between my book and other books is I try to focus, one, on the internationality of the Black Mormon experience, two, how it isn't necessarily about the priesthood ban, and three, how there's more to it than just what leaders said. Right? It's what average, ordinary Latter-day Saints thought and felt and experienced about the Black Mormon relationship. And you look at Goddard, where in his eyes, he saw Africa not as like the dark continent. He said, I see it as a continent of blazing light. It's a wonderful place. And, it's a place where I can shake off the anxieties that the Western world places upon me. Right? I can de-stress. I can go and engage in native dancing, which of course is racially problematic in its own right. But he does reflect that there was a whole spectrum of thought on Black people within the white Mormon community at this time.
How do you, the book's fairly new, so how do you expect, or how has it been received by the Black community within the church?
Well, on the one of the blurbs, I reached out to Tamu Smith and Xander Vrain, so to the degree that they are representative of the Black Mormon community, they start out by saying, you might wonder what a white man could possibly say to two Black women about Black Mormon history. Surprisingly, a whole lot. So, in general, it's been received positively. And Marvin Perkins, he's had positive things to say about it as well. So obviously, I'm open to criticism. I'm open to people saying that my white privilege has informed some aspect of the narrative. I welcome that. So if that criticism comes up, I would love to hear about it. Yes.
What degree of fallout was there following 1978 within more Orthodox members of the church?
I'm sorry, say that again.
What degree of fallout was there after 1978 within more Orthodox members of the church?
So you use the word Orthodox, so you generally see little amongst Orthodox members of the church, and by that I mean people who affiliate with the mainstream members of the church. They sustain President Kimball as a prophet and revelator, etc. But you do see kind of a flashpoint with the
sort of a birch fringe.
I wouldn't even say birch fringe to be because Ezra Taft Benson was to some degree part of the birch fringe, and he was on board with official declaration number 2. I would call them more fundamentalist Latter-day Saints.
And there's not polygamous ones, or even polygamous ones.
Oh, they were the kind where they. I don't know if they were practicing polygamy, but they were certainly sympathizers with polygamists.
Okay.
There was a group called Concerned Latter-day Saints, and they released a large ad in the Salt Lake Tribune, and in this they give a long line of cases in which the LDS Church had caved to public opinion. Okay. They said, "Listen, we gave up on this, and now we're giving up on this too."
Snuffer just did the same thing a year ago.
And you can actually find a blog post in which Denver Snuffer gives voice to this exact same concern.
Right.
Snuffer was not a fan of official declaration number 2. And that's
because he saw it as caving.
Yeah, he saw it as caving in the same way that the church caved on polygamy. This group, they believed in the famous one mighty and strong language from the Doctrine and Covenants. It's like there are a few select Latter-day Saints who really believe in the church, who really believe in its purity, and someday they will rise up and they will be the true guardians of true Mormonism, and we look forward to that day coming. So I would say there was a fallout amongst fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. You do see some unease in South Africa. You see some, listen, I'm an Afrikaner. I am proud of my Afrikaner ancestry, but the church said so. So I'll just swallow it and take it in the jaw and deal with it, but I don't like it.
What about the Old South?
In the Old South, I didn't do a lot of local area studies on the church in the South, so there likely were some comments made amongst white Southerners to that end. But to be quite honest, I can't speak to that.
as a follow-up to the same conversation, I think it's really interesting. So what you're saying is that amongst mainstream Latter-day Saints, it doesn't seem like there was a huge backlash or falling off or tons of people just going inactive after this because they felt that the church had fallen away. Most people, it seems by and large, sustained.
Accepted that the process.
Right, maybe grudgingly, maybe happily, but...
What's really interesting is, as a comparative that I can make to this, which was 7 years later when the reorganized church started ordaining women to the priesthood and lost a quarter of their membership. And they are considerably more progressive in their culture than the Utah Latter-day Saint Church. So it's really interesting to me that you see that dynamic, and particularly over those two issues, which are often compared now as things which cave to public pressure and things like that. Why such a dramatic reaction in one group than us? And this is just more me babbling out. Probably a future article will be.
Babbling is welcome.
Yeah.
So, no, that's a very interesting comparison. I've enjoyed comparing how the Community of Christ / RLDS Church has grappled with their racial history, right? Because they began giving blacks the priesthood as early as 1865. I mean, that's when they received their revelation. I mean, their official declaration were two, as it were. And I mean, there were obviously very, very few black members of their RLDS Church, just as there were very, very few black members of the LDS Church.
They came out in 1865 with the declaration, but they didn't really get on board as a community until like 1905. In fact, Joseph Smith III said, yes, we acknowledge that blacks should receive the priesthood, but
it should be done in due order.
Yeah,
right?
That was a place in society right now where we're going to fully integrate them. So
right. I mean,
but we're okay with it.
Yeah, we'll ordain them, and we need to take measured steps. We shouldn't do it too much, but we'll allow it. Right?
Theologically,
it could work in certain circumstances. So
it's interesting.
It is. Yes.
So what was the last straw as far as the priesthood ban? Did it have to do with the succession crisis with Okatabi, right?
William McCary.
Right.
He had all kinds of issues.
Right. Yeah. So was that the last straw, do you think?
The evidence suggests that was the last straw for Brigham Young. Yeah. But when William McCary, okay, so let me give you some background on who William McCary was. William McCary was a biracial musician / huckster who he really liked to affiliate with Latter-day Saint communities. He hung out with the Strangites a little bit, and he hung out with the Brighamites a little bit. And in early 1847, he moved to winter quarters, married a fairly prominent white Latter-day Saint girl named Lucy Stanton. Her father had been a stake president. And Brigham Young was initially quite welcoming to William and Lucy. In fact, at one point, William was basically saying, "Does my black skin, does that make me ineligible for full membership in the church?" Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, everybody said, "No, the color doesn't matter. Right? Welcome to the community. We're happy to see you. You don't see any comments about interracial marriage. You don't see any criticism of their interracial sexuality. It seems like a big love fest for William McCary." Brigham Young leaves winter quarters to go to Utah, and William McCary begins to implement a form of interracial polygamy. And understand that as Brigham Young was being, as inclusive as he was, you have ordinary Latter-day Saints hurling all kinds of racial epithets at William McCary and his wife. In fact, one person said, "There goes that old N-word," and his white wife. So the second Brigham Young left, it actually removed any kind of umbrella of protection that William McCary might have enjoyed. And then when he began practicing polygamy, that crosses all kinds of social boundaries. It's the kind of thing that could cost a black man his life in any part of the country. Right? Not just the South, but anywhere. So he's run out of town along with his white wife. And it's in this context that you see Parley P. Pratt and Orson Hyde give voice to really the first articulation of the priesthood restriction. And it's in language that echoes the Old Testament. To some degree, it echoes the translation of the Book of Abraham. And
so a lot of Cain, a lot of Ham, a lot of lineage.
Not a lot of Cain. Parley P. Pratt cited Ham.
Just Ham, huh?
Just Ham, right? Now, was probably implying Cain as well. Okay, that's possible. We don't have evidence for that. It was Brigham Young who really hammered on the Cain aspect of it.
Okay.
So Brigham Young, he comes back in December of 1847. He catches wind of this. And this forces Brigham Young to deal with his own racial sensibilities in ways that he had that we don't have a lot of evidence that he had. I mean, we knew that he used the N-word. He talked about dancing like N-words, but interracial sexuality, I mean, that was something he couldn't deal with too much. And when he heard that William McCary was sleeping with all these white women, like, he could maybe deal with sleeping with one white woman, but sleeping with all these other, it played at all kinds of stereotypes that black people had to face in antebellum America. So he makes these comments where he sounds profoundly racist,